In this module, we are going to talk about one of the most important front-end technology, which is JavaScript. Back in the day, JavaScript was like the most common front-end language, which was just like used for front-end. But nowadays, JavaScript, you can almost find it everywhere. You can build front-end, back-end, mobile application, artificial intelligence, automation. It's almost like you can find JavaScript in everywhere. So understanding JavaScript and to be able to work with, it's really important skill for you if you wanted to, let's say, be a good developer in this area. So the objectives for this course, I'm not gonna go into too much details, but I'm gonna give you like all the skills that you need to be able at least to read and write a simple code in JavaScript, and to be able to perform a different JavaScript programming blocks such as conditions, loops, variables, all these stuff. You have to be able to understand it, especially when you wanted to work with, let's say, back end, front end. You have to be able to understand how all these things are working together. So let's start with what is JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that developers use to add interactivity level to the end user at the client side, which means most of the time your code, when we are talking about front end, that means your code will be rendered by the browser at the client side. But when we are talking about JavaScript, like let's say for the backend, then that means it's rendered on the server side. But for now, we are talking about JavaScript on the front end side. That means all the rendering process is going to be done at the browser, at the user, or at the end user. Okay, you can use like JavaScript to build or even like consume, let's say, browser API. Back in the day, we are not able to communicate with, let's say, the browser API without JavaScript. You only can, like any browser, provide an API to interact with, let's say, the window, the documents, all these kind of built-in objects in the browser. How to communicate with it, you will not be able to do it without JavaScript. So we can say, in another word, JavaScript make it easy for us to interact with different API to be able to build a better applications. Okay, and as I said, JavaScript may run on both sides, client or the server side, but for here, our focus is going to be about JavaScript on the front end side. In the future modules, we are going to talk about how to use JavaScript on the server side too. So one important thing about JavaScript, which is like really important for you as a developer to understand, is JavaScript is interpreted language. When we say interpreted language, any programming language, most of the time we have like either one of two approaches to compile these files. Either to use interpreter or we use the compiled version. For example, like in Java, it's considered as compiled programming language. When we say compiled, that means you will write your code, then you will compile your code, you'll generate some binary code when you can just like consume it on, let's say, on the devices that's going to be used using your computer, your application. So let's say, in like a different way, if you are writing a code with, let's say, C++, you will write your code, the compiler's gonna compile all your code, and it's gonna generate executable file. This file, you can use this just executable file. So when you are trying to ship your application, you will ship your application as, let's say, an executable file. On the other hand, when we are talking about interpreted language, all the time, you will just like ship your code. Whenever you wanted to run it, it's gonna like be called on the fly. So when we talk about JavaScript, most of the time, when you write your code, you will save it. Once the page that has your code be requested, then the rendering engine will go through the whole code and read it for you, line by line. So when we say like interpreted language, that means the order you write your code is really matter. We cannot, or you cannot just use the code like as a whole. Okay, and you will understand like why in a bit. So as I said, it's really important to understand that JavaScript is not Java. Most like of the people thinks that Java and JavaScript has the same roots, but in reality, no. JavaScript is it's completely different than Java. Okay, so let's try to understand like how does JavaScript rendering and why I said or I mentioned that it's really important to write your code in order or the order matters. So the way it's working, let me try to use the pointer here. So the rendering engine, all your HTML code will start to read from here, read until it finds here. When the browser finds this line, then it's gonna switch to the JavaScript mode, and the JavaScript mode will read this line and read this line. And by the way, white spaces, like let's say blank lines, it's not considered in the rendering engine. So it's gonna read this line, this line. So the way it's working with the interpreted language, in case you've been able as an interpreter to interpret this line without any errors, then you will carry on with the next line. If you find let's assume you find an error here. So all the previous code will be rendered at this point. And once it finds an error, it's just like gonna exit from the rendering. So you cannot just like try to call, let's say, a function without defining the function first. Okay, so it's really important. So all the time, the interpreted language, it's gonna just like read your code line by line. This is the case with PHP, with Python, all interpreted language or scripting language. Most of the time, it's called as interpreted language because whenever you wanted to consume this code, it's gonna like the interpreter will be called to go through the whole, let's say, code lines and compile it for you. When you wanted to work with JavaScript, there are 3 ways that you wanted to use or you may use to include your JavaScript code. It's almost the same thing as what we learned with CSS. You may use inline inclusion, or you may use internal inclusion, or you may use external inclusion. So for when we talk about inline inclusion, that means you're gonna write your JavaScript code on the tag level. Okay, so it's almost the same thing. When we say in CSS, we used to do style equal, then we write the align style. So the same thing here, but instead of just like using the style, we are using something we call it events. Okay, and we will learn about events in a bit. But for now, let's say it's important to understand that there's a way that you can just like write your JavaScript as an inline. When we say an inline, that means it's gonna be written on the level of the HTML tag. So when we say like the internal inclusion, that means you may write your code with HTML and you should enclose your, let's say, your code with script tag. When you are talking about the external, and by the way, this is the best practice, is to separate HTML from JavaScript. So most of the time, you will find us working with external JavaScript or external inclusion. So in this case, you write your code in JavaScript file. And by the way, the JavaScript file extension is JS. So you will start like any file, you will start to type your code. Once you want to save it, just make sure you save it, this file with the JS extension, okay? So this is the example of a line inclusion. The line inclusion, as you say, like as you can see here, we have this tag button here, and this is like a JavaScript code. The way that we can implement or inject the JavaScript within HTML is by using something we call it events, because JavaScript is event-based programming language. So you may trigger or perform your JavaScript based on specific action or specific event. So in this case, our code will be only rendered when we click on this button here, okay? So for the internal inclusion, as I said, we only use, like, we type our code within the script tag. Okay, so the script tag has one parameter, which is the type, which decide what kind of scripting are you using. Back in the day, there were like many scripting languages. One of them was VB script. You like gonna use the same tag with a different type than JavaScript. Okay, so one important thing here, which is in some cases, you may use your inclusion at the end of the page, and you might use it here in this area, in the head area. And the rule here is, if your code is relying or depends on one of the tags that you're gonna show here or you're gonna have it in the body, then it's better practice to have your inclusion in this area. But if your code is just like general functions, then you may use it in this area. That's really important here. So let's say in this command here, or in this code here, I'm trying to update the div with the hello world, which is this one, after it's been initialized. That means I cannot just like do, let's say, the update for something is not there. So if I'm gonna take this code here and put it over here, as I said before, it's rendering engine, right? So it's gonna take it like line by line. So if I take this code from here to here and place it here, is there like any previous div that's named or called at this point here called hello world? And the answer is no. That's why you cannot just like use it, because the code here is relying on something must be present to be able to perform it, or else it's gonna give you like an error. Okay, that's really important. Where you include your code is really important. Okay, so for the external inclusion, it's the same thing, but you're gonna specify the src here, which is like the source code, and you will define the name of the file and make sure it's usually ended with JS. When you are trying to use this approach, as I said, you just like type your JavaScript code as it is. And the same here with internal inclusion. You may use your code here, or you may include your JavaScript here, or you may include it here. So the rule here, as I said, if your code is relying on something, or you wanted to show something, or you want to like manipulate one of the objects that's shown here, then it's better to include it here. But if it's just like public functions and it's gonna be called later, then it's better to be here to be able like to download it and ahead of time. Another important um, building block for any programming language, which is the variables. In variables, it's just like a placeholder in the memory where you can just store your data during the running of your application. In JavaScript, it's really good programming language because it's not strongly typed programming language as like of Java or C Sharp, where you have to decide the data type of the variables before uh, you may use it. In JavaScript, you may use the keyword var to initialize the variable, and based on the value you assign to that variable, then the interpreter is gonna set the data type for that based on the value you are assigned to that variable. So let's say here the variable x, the assigned number is just 1, so the data type for x now is just number. The same with student grade here. And even like you can just like initialize a variable without assign any let's say any types, any value. And here, since you already just initialize the variable, here once you assign the value, based on the value, the interpreter is going to decide the data type for it, and you may use this one like alert here to see the results of this stuff. One important part when you are working with like any programming language, which is the global variable and local variable. When we say global variable, that means it's a variable that is accessible from anywhere from your code. And one example here, which is a global variable, anything beneath this code here, global variable will be available to it. On the other hand, when we say about local variable, that means it's just like in the building blocks that it's related to. So for example, private variable here or local variable, it's located here. So the scope of this variable is just like within the function that named testing. But you cannot just like use it from here or any other places other than just in testing. So in another word, local variable is just like in the area that you initialize it in. In the global variable, that means it's available for all the functions, all the pieces of code you have in your system. So the variable data types, as I said, JavaScript is not strongly typed programming language, which means you can like the variable data type will be set based on the value you assign to it. Okay. In JavaScript, there are like many types. You have numbers, you have string, objects, array, boolean, all these kind of let's say standard data types, which is available in almost like all the programming languages. So for this one here, let's see what's the output for this one. So for this one here, when we initialize the var numVar here, and we assign number 10, then the number here is just gonna be number. And by the way, when we say number, that means all kind of numbers, float numbers, double numbers, integer numbers, all this stuff is denoted as a number in JavaScript. Okay, and for string, we can just like use any text, or even like we can just use numbers, but if it's enclosed with double quotes here, that means it's gonna be the interpreter is gonna deal with this data type as a string. A Boolean variable, it's gonna be either true or false. One thing which is really good about like JavaScript, but it's always a problem for new developers in JavaScript. Let's take this line here. The fun var is 10, which is number, and 5, which is number, and string here, which is just a string. So how does JavaScript deal with this scenario? Since you can just like do arithmetic here on 10 and 5, but you cannot do this one on here. So here we can say the string is has a higher domination here. Therefore, all these stuff, or number 10 and 5, will be dealt with as a string. So the output of this entry here should be 105 string variable. Okay, so this is like really important when you are trying to perform some operations on different data types. Make sure that always when you're dealing with a string has like, or string has a higher domination, so you cannot just like merge numbers with a string. In this case, if you're gonna do it, then the output is gonna be just like plain string. So another type which is really important to understand in JavaScript, which is JavaScript object. In JavaScript objects, it's just like one variable that has multiple values, or that holds multiple values with different key. So the way it's working is the object starts with curly braces here, and this called as a key, and this is the value of that key. Or in some like programming language like Python, they call it a dictionary. Okay, this is like one way of creating or initialize an object variable. Another way to create an object variable, which is using the object, let's say, implementation in JavaScript, and you create whatever methods or properties here this way. So this is like the object name, and this is either the method or the property. So in this case, all this stuff is just let's say properties here. But you still, if you wanted to create a function here or create a method, you may, instead of just like assign a value, you may assign just a function. Okay, and this, in this case, you may like, even like with JavaScript object, you may create one object with multiple functions. And this is the case when we say like JavaScript is object oriented. This is the way that creates the object orientation in JavaScript. And as you can see, the output of that code here is something like this. And by the way, here, it's really good, let's say, really important for you as a developer to work with something like this, or to get yourself familiar with it. So let's say, if you're gonna open this document, if you right click and inspect, there's a web development tools here that you have to be able to work with. So in this case, as you can see the console here, because let me just show you the code here so you will be able to see everything. As you can see here, I'm trying to send the output to the console. So anything, if you want, like while you are working with your code, either to work with something like alert, which is gonna create a pop-up message, or you may use just the console, where you're gonna direct your output to the console from here. And as you can see, these are the outputs of your operation. So the console should be your friend while you're trying to debug your work. Okay, so let's get back. So another important thing in JavaScript, which is the operators. Operators means when you are trying to achieve some task in JavaScript, you need some help from some of, let's say, the symbols that has special meaning. So in JavaScript, JavaScript supports multiple kind of operators. It supports arithmetic operators where you can just like do mathematical operations. It supports comparison operators. It supports logical assignments, and we will see all of them right now. So when we talk about arithmetic operators, we are talking about addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, raising to the power, the remainder, all these kind of operators. And it's almost the same thing as in any programming language that you are familiar with. So for example, let's assume that we have two variables here, 10 and 3. We can do addition by using a plus sign. We can use subtraction. The only thing that it's like might be different from some of the other programming languages, which is this one, which is the power. So the power here means two asterisks here or two stars. This is like the denotation of the power. Okay. Another arithmetic operators, which is considered as arithmetic operators, which are the incremental or decremental. So here, the first value here, that means add 1 to the current value of the first value here. So you may just like go and check. And it's really important to know that in JavaScript, you may use these operators before or after. So if you're gonna use it before, that means the addition is gonna be done before you may use this variable. But if you have it at the end, that means you will use this variable first, then you may, or the addition will take a place. When we are working with arithmetic operators, it's really important to understand the precedence of these operators. As any programming language, always there is like some precedence table. It's almost the same thing here in JavaScript. So when you are talking about like if you are given this equation here, always the addition and let's say I forgot the name of it, but the addition here or the subtraction, which is attached to the value or to the variable, it's gonna be the highest priority. Then after that, you're gonna go with the parentheses here. Then any addition, not addition, it's any multiplication and division will take place. Then any addition and subtraction will be the lowest priority. So for this one, this is like the breakdown how it's all done. You can just like verify it by yourself on your time. So the comparison operators, which is compare two values. And most of the time we're using comparison operators with like or an if condition, or especially like to check whether a specific condition is valid or not. So let's assume that we have three variables here. If we are, or let's say the output of trying to check whether the first value has the equal amount of the third value, as you can see, the value here is 10 and the value here is 10. But the difference is here is number and here is a string. And for JavaScript, as I said, since it's dynamic programming language, if you are using just two equals here, that means you care more about the value. So the check here will be on the value level, not on the data type. So in this case, 10 is equal to 10. That means it's gonna give you true results here. Okay, and the same thing with not equal. This is like the sign for not equal. There's another type of comparison here, which is three equals. Three equals means you are going to check the value and let's say the data type for that variable to see whether they are identical or not in terms of value and type. So if you are using just two equals here, that means you want to check whether they are both variables are identical in terms of value or not. But when you are using these three equals, that means you are trying to check whether they are identical in terms of value and the data type. And here, obviously, you can say it's false because it's true that they are identical in value, but they are not identical in data type. This one is number and this one is string. Okay, and also you can just like as any other programming language, greater than or equal, less than or equal. You can just like use it as any other programming language. So the logical operators is basically three kind of logical operators, and most of the time it's used to combine multiple conditions or to check multiple conditions. So the first one is OR. So when we are talking about OR, that means either one of the condition should be true to proceed. So in this case, let's say if first value is greater than 5, the output, the evaluation output for this one is going to be false, but this one is going to be false too. So you cannot just like perform this one here, right? No, the first value is, yeah, okay. And the other thing, which is here, it's really important to understand that when you are using OR, if one of these conditions has fulfilled, then there is no way, or you don't need to go and evaluate the rest of all these conditions, because with OR you only need one true evaluation. So when you are working with AND, that means you have to have all these evaluations true. So this one should be true and this one should be true to be able to perform this, let's say, this operation. Okay, and the last kind of, or last type of logical operators, which is the negation or the opposite of the current value here. So for example, here, the initialized value here is false. If you're gonna go with like just printing out this output here, it's gonna give you true because it's gonna give you the opposite of the current value here. So the last kind of the operators that we are discussing in this course, which is the assignment operators. In the assignment operators, it's almost like we can use like just like as any assignment. We're using equal to do the assignment. There's another assignment which is something like this, which is perform an action or arithmetic operation, then assign the value. So this one, let's say this line here, if we are using this statement, that's almost the same thing as we are using total equal total times 2. So this is the way it's working. So we can use multiplication or division or remainder, all the same way. So since we are saying like JavaScript is a dynamic programming language, we don't need to specify data type. In some cases and in some scenarios, we need to have a specific kind of casting or let's say specifying a data type for a specific operation. So for example, what in this case, let's say the second variable is like the interpreter will consider it as a string. But what if I want to change or convert this string into number? What should I do? And this is like the way it's working. If you wanted to like to specify or force JavaScript to deal with this variable as a specific data type, you may use parseInt to cast it as let's say as a number, or you may do something like this if you want to cast it as a string. And for sure, if you want to cast it as a boolean, you can just like call the function which is boolean and pass the variable that you want to change it to one of these results. So let's try to evaluate this line here. This line here, I'm not using any casting operations here. So the first value and the second and the third, what are the numbers? So let's say I'm trying to perform an arithmetic operation. And as you know, arithmetic operation where it's performed, or let's say the plus sign when it's performed on numbers, it's going to do the addition. But what if you have, let's say, strings? If you have strings, it's going to be performed as concatenation. So the meaning of this plus sign, if you are using all numbers, that means perform arithmetic operation. But if you are trying to perform the same operation on strings or this kind of stuff, then it's gonna do or perform as concatenation. So for this one, the output will be considered as 10 as a string, or it's like JavaScript is gonna convert it to a string, 3 as a string, and the last one as a string too. So the output of this evaluation here, or this line, it's gonna be 103 true. If in case, let's say, you wanted to force JavaScript to work with these two variables as an integer or number, then you can use parse int to convert these two numbers. Okay. The really important thing here, which is why the output is going to be 10, 3, while it should be 13. Because here, it's going to be dealt with it as, or let's say, the concatenation here will be performed first. So 10 concatenated with 3, it's going to give you 103 as a string. The parse int here, it's going to convert 103 string into 103 number. If you want to perform this operation on both sides as a parse integer, then you may do something like this. You parse integer as for the first one, and then to the second one. In this case, the output is going to be 13. This is really important for you to understand, because most of the time, these kind of problems or errors, it's really hard to discover, because the interpreter is not going to give you any error. This is like, we can say it's a logical error that you cannot just like figure it out without really good understanding of what's going on with your code. So as any other programming language, JavaScript is shipped with conditional statements where you can just like evaluate some of the statements to check whether it's true or false. And the way it's working, you can just like use if, you can use if else if, and you can use if else. You can use all these kind of standards conditional statements, as you can see here. The thing is, it's really important to understand that when you are working with conditions, you only perform what's in there, or the enclosed value here as this one here, if the evaluation has a true value from here. So if you are using AND, that means all the conditions should be true. If you are using OR, one of these conditions should be true. So the other one, which is like the other conditional statement, which is switch, when you are working with like multiple values. As you can see, this code snippet here has evaluation, whether like today is a weekday or weekend. And as you can see here, you may, like, if you wanted to have the same results for multiple cases, you may write it this way. So in case of 1 or 7, which is Saturday or Friday. Okay, you may use it this way, or you can just like in case of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you can just perform the same thing, which is print out it's a weekday. So the other thing, which is like another important building block for any programming language, which is the repetition, or how to do a loop. For like repetition statements, there are two types of repetition statements in JavaScript. One of them, which is for, and for there are two types. So JavaScript offers you with 4 types of repetition blocks. The first one, which is like the default for statement, in any repetition, in any programming language, you always need 3 main steps or 3 main parameters to work. The first one, which is the starting point, and for it's just like here, this is like the starting point, and the stop point, where, or some people they call it a stop condition, when this loop or this repetition will stop or terminated. And for each repetition, what is the increment size, or some people they call it steps, okay, or the step size. So in this case, we'll start from 1, we'll go until we reach or hit number 11, and for each repetition we're gonna increase I by 1. This is just like one way to do for. The other way, which is, or another component here, or block that JavaScript provide, which is for n. So this kind of statements usually used when you have an array and you wanted to iterate over all these elements. So instead of just like trying to do it the same way with for, you may, like for simplicity, you may use this one here. So for var I n, the array variable. So it's gonna iterate over all these, let's say, array elements and try to perform some action. And in this one here, it's gonna perform one thing, which is do the square for each number in this array. Okay. So another or the other type of repetition, which is while. As I said, like JavaScript provide you with 2 types of while, but all the time, as we said, any repetition should have a starting point, and it should have condition, and it should have incremental hop or steps. One important difference between while and do while, which is in do while, at least you're gonna perform the enclosed text here or the enclosed code here at least 1, even like if the condition will not be validated. But on the other hand, when you are talking about, let's say, while, it's gonna be performed if this condition is valid. Okay. Another important thing, which is the functions. The functions, as you may know, it's just like a group of statements that is grouped together to create one building block. Whenever you wanted to use it, you can just like reuse it in different project, in different location, instead of just like typing everything all the time, almost the same thing. So the function is gonna reduce the number of code you are trying to do, and even like it's gonna add some extra level of maintainability for your code. So in case you wanted to develop or maintain your code, it's gonna be easier if it's written in functions. So all the time you have to use functions, even like the operation is just like 1 or 2 lines. It's always good practice to have it as a function. So to define a function in JavaScript, you may use function keyword and add the function name, and the naming here is always like any other programming language. You cannot have any specific symbols. You cannot have spaces in the name of the function. So it's what applies in like different languages such as Java should be applied here. And here, just like the parameters you want to pass, if you wanted to pass some parameters, then you may pass it. If not, then you can just like create a function even without any parameters. In some cases, you might return some values from your function, or you want to perform any actions. So all the functionalities that you're already familiar with in any programming languages, when I talk like about functions, it's almost the same thing as here. But the only difference here, like let's say if you want to compare the functions in JavaScript and the function in, let's say, in PHP, it's almost the same thing, but you cannot define a data type for the returned value. Or let's say in C. In C, you have to define the data type or the return data type. So if you don't want to return any value, you would use void. If you wanted to use, like, let's say, return an integer value, then you may use int. So as any programming language, arrays is really important when you are working with programming. It's really important data structure that it's like, let's say it's a base for multiple or different kind of let's say programming approach. And this one, you may create an array in a different way. The simplest way is just like to enclose it this way, or you may use something like first array, then you can just use a new array as an object, which is like one of the core implementation of JavaScript, but it's almost the same thing as the C array, which is the same thing. The one thing to note here, which is it's really important to understand that in JavaScript array, you may have a different data type for the elements in array. So the array could have, let's say, string elements in the first, and you may have boolean here. You may have let's say number here. So you can have a mixed data type of elements in array. Okay, and this is like just like one implementation, and JavaScript provides really nice and good variety of let's say methods that you can perform on arrays, such as sorting, searching, all these kind of stuff. Even if you want to change or convert a specific array to a string, you may use toString to perform this action, and you can just like use it, use this code here for your practice and to see what's going on with it. So the last topic here in this chapter, we are going to talk about JavaScript events. So most of the time when you are working with JavaScript, you would like to perform your code based on a specific event. So let's say if you wanted to validate whether the user has entered the right information in the form or not. So you cannot just like check it all the time or just do like checking all the time. You would just like have a function written there, wait for the action to occur. So let's say if the user clicks on the form, then this is the time when you want to check whether the form entries are valid or not. So as written here, most of the time when working with JavaScript, you would perform actions when an event, here it's event, when an event occur. So what kind of event that JavaScript supports? It supports like events coming from mouse events coming from the keyboard. Let's say if you want to let's say if you click using the mouse, or you double click, or you hover over some places. So all these kind of stuff are actions. In addition, there are like some events that you may encounter, such as let's say when you are working with media, for example. There are some specific events related to the media. Let's say when let's say on play, on rewind, on fast forward. All these are predefined events that you might use, and even you can create your own events. So JavaScript and let's say HTML give you the ability to do this kind of stuff. So the general form of events is always like this: on, this is like on, and these dashes here is denoted as the event. So if you want to say on click, then you may write on click. If you want to do like double click, then it's gonna be on DBL click. Let's say if like a keyboard a key has been pressed on the keyboard, then you may say on key press. It's all like will be something like this, and the way you attach it to the tag is through, or you add this keywords here as an attribute to the HTML tag to try to link where the action will take place. So let's say this is like the code snippet that we have here. So we have this entry, and as you can see, on key press, all the time, if you see something like on, that means this is event. And here in this case, whenever a user clicks or press on any key on the keyboard, this action or this function will be performed. Okay, and this is like really important to understand. So how do you know all these kind of events? You may go to one of the cheat sheets to find like a list of all the events, and even you can create your own events using one of let's say the implementation extension in JavaScript, such as add event listener. You can create your own event. So at the end of this module, JavaScript, like any other programming language, the more you practice, the better you are. Even like with your life, it's like a muscle. The more work out you do, the more stronger muscles you have. Another really important thing, which is do not try to memorize everything. Just like use any good JavaScript cheat sheet, and I'm just like proposing one of these good cheat sheets where you can have like everything. It's about like 24 pages. It's true, it's not that's like, let's say, not just like one page, but it has almost all the aspects that you're gonna need when you are working with JavaScript. So it's really good reference to have it with you. Okay, this is the end of this module. I will see you in the coming modules. Thank you.